There we go.
There was a purpose for me being here.
There was. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and jump into it. So one of the biggest reasons for this lunch and learn was that we were seeing the attribute and library pollution starting to resurface. If we just jump right to it, we could see that right away in this project. I'm sure, in fact, I know many of you have seen these HAG, Innovic, StoLab objects populating your project. The issue is that even if we were to purge these out on the send and receive or the save as, they repopulate. These are generated conceptually just so you understand why these are here. Some manufacturers years and years ago would include an object that had embedded surfaces with it. Conceptually, it made sense because they wanted you to be able to place their furniture or appliance or whatever and have a collection of objects to choose from. So they wanted to be able to say, you can use birch on this particular chair or piece of furniture. You can use this Innovic fabric on that chair or furniture. So it's all stemming from a project that was clear back from 2011. And we know that because it's tagged to a library that keeps repopulating. So if we go to the library manager, here we can see exactly where that comes from. So it's not sufficient to just delete the surfaces because they're just going to come back. And in fact, they usually come back in duplicates and or triplicates. So here's this from 2011-01, textures, master GDL objects. These master GDL objects are the objects in which those surfaces are embedded. So anytime these objects make it into your project, they're going to bring that surface with them. And that's why we see those duplicates and triplicates, because oftentimes that from 2011-01 folder that contains these master GDL objects gets put in here multiple times. So in this case, we can see at least twice in this particular file, those objects have been populated. Unfortunately, these are populated via hot links, which is really tedious to clean up and remove. Basically, you have to purge or embed the hot link before you can clear out the library, and you have to do that before you can clear out the surfaces. So once it's in a hot link, it's a huge headache to clear out. It's not just a quick process. You can track this hot link down via the hot link manager and break the hot link. That will then move this to the embedded library where it can be cleaned out effectively. So that's a big headache, and that's one that in this particular project, for example, we're going to have to come together as a team and figure out the timing to do that, because essentially you have to remove, purge, or break the hot link, which then involves cleaning up the original source, and it's a whole game of stacking the deck and shuffling the cards. The danger with this, I don't want to necessarily get into the weeds on that part, because that, like I said, requires a team strategy, and one that it's, I think, best if I or at least someone from the BIM team is involved in. The real problem is if, for example, I have just a couple of lines, right? Like lines or lines and text, elements that don't even include surfaces of any kind. There's no way to drag a surface along with these, but if I copy these and paste them into here, all right, so I just copied lines in a text box into this blank file. And now if I go up to my library manager, it brought this from 2011-01 with it. So anything you copy and paste from one file to the next, it's always best in this file, for example, to just quickly check the surfaces for and they stand out because they're italicized, they're all lowercase, they don't fit our naming convention. Look for those surfaces. You know, you can always go file new, create a new project file, you know, and we could use this as our example and say, okay, well, that brought these surfaces with it. And we know that it created that pollution because not only did it create that folder in the embedded library, but it also brought these surfaces with it. So we have the HAG, Innovic, StoLab stuff. So I've always called this sandboxing. So if this is stuff that I needed in my project file, I would copy it to a blank file. You just literally, you go file new, use the latest project template or latest project settings and launch in a new instance. And then once that's open, then you can paste into this file and then go to your library manager. Look for the from 2011-01 folder or any master GDL objects. It's not this folder that's causing the pollution. It's actually these master GDL objects. This folder is just a telltale sign. This is always coming in with those master GDL objects. There have been cases where these have come in outside or without the from 2011-1 folder. So the master GDL master GDL.gsm or master GDL.gdl are always the objects that you want to look for that pollution. They're always going to be in the embedded library. So don't worry about any master GDL objects in any of the linked or BIM server libraries. Always part of the embedded library. And then you can just blow those out of the embedded library and say, okay. And then when we go to the attribute manager, now you're not going to want to go to the surfaces, because clicking on a surface here and saying delete, for example, it's going to be really tedious to delete all that out of there. So if you go to the attribute manager and go to the surfaces, you can sort by name. And because the naming convention of these doesn't follow our naming convention, they should stand out as being unique. Unfortunately, this is from the template, but in any case, they always come in italicized. And they're always this Stolab, Innovic, and Hag surface names. So you can grab all of those in this sandbox file. And anything really italicized in here, and delete those out of here. And then when you say, okay, apply and close, now this is a clean file. So you can copy and paste from this file to your working file. It's sort of an in-between step. Also, if you ever see anything in your file in the surfaces that looks like that, Hag, Stolab, Innovic file names, go straight to the library manager and look for where it's at in there. It's a problem that compounds itself because it copies from file to file so easily. We've weeded it out several times, but going back to old archive files oftentimes makes it resurface. I did a sweep of all projects in the office, and we've seen it in at least half of the files. Many of those have been cleaned up since. Many of them include this issue of the library manager actually compartmentalizing it into these module libraries, these hot link libraries, which, like I said, is a lot more tedious to clean up. You actually need to go to the hot link module manager and break all of the hot links out of the file in order to clean it up. So you could do that by selecting the hot links here, and unfortunately you have to do it one by one. And obviously you would only need to do the ones that you knew had an issue.
I would also say, Patrick, that for your naming convention of surfaces, it's best to follow the master format with like the number prefix before the name. That way it's easy to organize by name, and all of your surfaces that have a number prefix will stack on the top, and then the pollution surfaces will all be organized together, which do not have a number prefix.
That's exactly correct, Chris. And that was sort of, in this example, I mistakenly created this from the out-of-the-box template, not from the recent project. So when you do this sandbox, if you go File New, don't create from the template, create from the latest project settings. That's going to ensure that the naming convention with those attributes follows suit. And that, just like we saw in this other one, lists those attributes under the attribute manager. It will list them as sort of subsequent to our standard naming convention. And this is sort of what I was afraid of with this file, is it's such a big file that it gets really tedious. And I'm hoping we don't have to wait too long. I wonder if
Patrick, when you break the hot links, you then have to bring them back in. So it's probably good practice to like set hotspots for where all of those modules live, right?
That's correct. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that it has to be strategized. So technically breaking the hot links does not discard the hot link. It actually embeds the content in the file. So rather than being hot linked, it's now embedded in the file. The best source, or the best way to handle it, if it is from a hot link and it's a hot linked building, is to put those hotspots in the floor plan, delete the hot link module completely. Don't even mess with the hot link module manager, and then clean the whole file up and then place the hot links back in. In this case, hot links were used for 2D details, so it's less of an issue. You know, still something to pay attention to. No, like what Chris was saying with regards to, sorry, I just had it open and now it's not wanting to cooperate again. Was that if the naming convention for your project, and that goes, I mean, that holds true with all naming conventions, is always use the naming convention that's been utilized in the onset of the project, and hopefully from the template. But that organizes those polluted attributes here by attribute name instead of number. So you can really quickly see they're all at the bottom. They don't have the CSI prefix. So it makes it really easy to select those. And you can see how many times these have been redundantly brought in. There's still lab fab 82 brown 1, 2, and 3. So there's all those redundancies because they've been copied in multiple times. So deleting those from the attribute manager, or I guess purging them out of the embedded library first, is the correct process. Delete them from the library and then clean up the attributes, and then the file's good to go. So this is one thing that causes files to bog down and slow significantly, is just trying to process all of these extra attributes and surfaces and the library content, really, because these master DDL objects bring those embedded pieces with them. So you can see here, like, it's still in there even though the hot links have been broken. So there's a little bit more digging and stuff that needs to go into cleaning this out, you know, in terms of purging that stuff fully. But because that's still in here, because these master GDL parts are still in here and they cannot be deleted because they're part of this hot link folder, it's a lot more work to purge these out once they make it to a module. So before you save a module, before you bring anything into a file, check your file for cleanness, check the file that you're copying from, and then use a sandbox to go as a go-between. So that's the first thing I wanted to cover, was just this library pollution. We need to get back on top of keeping this out of our projects. You know, that starts with anytime you're told to pull something from an old file, check that file for these things. Like I said before, the first check is going to be to see if it's in the surfaces, and then check the library manager to see if it's in the library. Those master GDL parts are in the library manager. The next thing to check in terms of file performance is polygon count. And everybody should have the polygon add-on. That's under Window, Palettes, and Polycount. And this brings up a palette. It could take a while to process depending on your project. In this case, the file actually, oh, it's only visible set to. Oh, you know what? I don't have any layers on, that's why. Let's just do this. I don't want to pull everything up because I don't want you guys to have to spend the whole afternoon watching my computer beach ball. But the polygon count is, unfortunately, it's a little bit subjective. You know, not all polygons are weighted equally. So objects handle polygons really well, but they're also the single biggest source of polygons in a file. You really need to look at the percent of contribution to polygons. Things like meshes shouldn't be contributing more than, I would say, 5 or 6% of the total polygons in the file. And ideally, there shouldn't be a file in the office that has more than 3 million polygons in it. If an object, for example, has been placed 500 times, but it's a low polygon object, it can still be slowing things down. It's best to diversify where those polygons are coming from. So, you know, ideally lower polygon objects are going to perform better, but at the same time, 5 million polygons coming from 5 million parts is still going to slow the file way, way And you can see here just the processing time trying to figure out how many polygons are in the furniture plan, for example, is obviously problematic that it's taking this long. Nobody should really have to wait 10, 15 minutes for a file to process. And this is sort of what instigated this lunch and learn, is that we have several projects, several files within the office that are starting to float well above the 5 GB range on the file server, causing a lot of teamwork conflicts, causing a lot of just lag time and waiting for these things, processing basic reservations, send and receive, basic navigation operations. And polygons can be a big contributing factor. So here it took that time to process just 700,000 polygons. You can see here that the biggest contribution to polygons is this whirlpool object. There's 10 instances, meaning that each instance is 5,200 polygons approximately. So for this particular view setting, this particular layer combination, the project seems to be fine, but you really want to check this with all layers and all renovation filters visible, and make sure that your total polygon count is no more than 3 million. Honestly, anytime we get over 3 million, the file starts to bog way down, and that no single element or sub-element is contributing more than about 5 to 10% of the total polygons. So we can see here, for example, morphs are contributing to almost 15% of the polygons in the current poly count view. So that might be something worth revisiting. At the same time, it's only 100,000 polygons. So if that's all of the morphs within the project, it's probably still within the scope of a healthy project if it's a 3 to 5 million polygon file. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the project map. This is one that often gets overlooked because we get into the view map, we start setting up these views, things go into layouts, we ignore the fact that the project map is even there. And there's a lot of things that goes on in the project map over the life of a project that are easy to ignore. The first thing and most obvious is these independent views. This happens anytime you place a section marker or an elevation marker and then delete it without deleting the viewpoint. So for example, if I place a section marker here, you could see that, and I'm just going to call this something obvious. So here's that section marker right there. If I were to delete the section marker, you're given an option to cancel, keep as independent, or delete viewpoint. This can also happen sometimes if I undo placing that section marker. It will oftentimes retain that viewpoint, depending on your work environment settings. You want to make sure that you're not saying keep as independent, because the reality is this is just like a detail or a worksheet viewpoint at this point. There's nothing linked to the model. So these independent viewpoints, unless they've been used to lay out details, at which point you really want to go in there and copy those back out to a detail viewpoint, really need to get purged from the project. Keeping the project map as slim as possible is going to help the file perform better. So all of these independent elevations really need to get purged out. Independent sections need to get purged out. This one's actually not too bad, but I've audited projects before where there's just a big long running list and probably only 5 or 6 active sections or elevations. So keeping these thin is going to help the file quite a bit. I've been noticing a trend with worksheets and with details in particular to get really bogged down with iterative studies, or a lot of times there's, for example, there's a worksheet in this particular file that's called master detail worksheet old. If we're going to take the time to label something old or label something not used, archive a version of the file out and just delete it. Like, there's no reason to maintain iterative studies within a single ArchiCAD file. We archive out files for a reason. Once something becomes irrelevant, it shouldn't be in the file anymore. In this case, this particular worksheet actually does contain quite a few things. And if they really are old and not used, I mean, it looks like there's some like wall section studies. There's all of these in here that may have gone missing when I purged those detail modules. But it's really easy to check what's on here. If you turn all layers on and select everything, type Command Option T on your keyboard brings up this edit selection set. This is a great tool. Its intended use is to be able to change multiple element types settings so that you could say all of these things are on the whatever detail layer, or using this pen, or change the renovation filter in groups so that you don't have to individually select by element type. But I like it just as a quick screen for how many elements are in this viewpoint. You can quickly see that there's 196 objects and 549 lines. And in the KR project has been having a lot of files that just have been bloating up towards the 10 gigabyte range, which makes them really cumbersome to work in. And I ran a ton of tests on what it would take to slim those down. And oddly enough, it seems counterintuitive, but the content on these worksheets and on these detailed viewpoints was the single biggest contributor to that file bloat. Once I purged down in the tests, once I purged down all of this 2D content, the files just shriveled up to almost nothing. They were like less than 3 gigs after cleaning out all of this stuff. So 2D content has a huge impact in the file. And that's one of the reasons I really want to stress that anything that we're going to take the time to label old or do not use, instead of doing that, archive the file and purge it out of here. And in this case, deleting the content from here might be a better solution than deleting the full worksheet if I'm not 100% certain that this worksheet wasn't placed to a layout, because I can always go into that archive and copy and paste it back into here, and I haven't lost anything from the view map. If you do delete it from the worksheet entirely, anytime that worksheet was saved to the view map is going to be gone now, meaning anything on a layout is going to have a missing drawing. Other areas to pay attention to that can cause file bloat. In this particular instance, for some reason, we were using it for import studies. We have these in our template as like import from interiors. The intent being that it would be like a piece of scratch paper, something to drop in a DWG or a PDF for a quick trace reference, really for temporary purposes. In this case, it's almost like this has been a redundant storage place for those DWGs, for those PDFs, and that's causing significant file bloat. What I was seeing was purging this stuff out was causing up to a 10 or 15% reduction in file size, just because we're storing those external drawings either linked or embedded in the file on these worksheets. So really use these the concept of these import worksheets sparingly. Another one, and it seems like it was probably cleaned out since I last did the studies on this, but we can use this as an example. So like details, for example, that have been crossed out. Like we took the time to cross that detail out, indicating that it's not being used. Instead of going through that process, let's just purge it out of here. The other thing is like iterative details, for example. Like here I could see that like this group of stuff is essentially duplicated to this group of stuff. And I think that has something to do with the nature of the modules used in this project. But if these modules are not being used anymore, they really should be purged out of the file. At which point we only have these details. And again, if we're going to take the time to cross them out, let's just get them out of the file. So we're more than stripping the content in this one worksheet by half, simply by doing that. So really using that element selection set as a tool to see how many elements are on these viewpoints. When I first looked at this file in particular, there were some of these worksheet viewpoints that had over 100,000 2D elements on them, which like is no surprise that that's bogging the file way down, especially in files older than ArchiCAD 24. So version 23 and previous meant that if I place this detail onto a sheet, it's processing all of that stuff every time this detail is placed, and then this detail is placed, and then this detail is placed. So all of that content is being processed for each drawing placed onto a sheet. So it's really critical to limit the content in a single viewpoint, not to eliminate it. We don't want a single viewpoint containing a single detail, but we also don't want all of this just redundant garbage and iterative studies floating around longer than it needs to be. Certainly take the time to iterate these details, understand the details completely. But in the case of this project, we're getting into construction documents, and we have 30, 40, 50 pages of details, and it's just really bogging things way down. So at that point, we really need to start cutting those iterations out. Just like we would in a floor plan. If you're doing iterative floor plans in the model, you don't keep those iterations around for the life of the project. You archive it out and purge it down to the current design. One other thing I'd like to say is about the details versus the worksheets, is I'd like to start to see sort of more consistent functions in the project map. So in this case, some of the details were drawn here, some of the details were drawn in worksheets. The template actually lays this out pretty clearly, I think, to where details are supposed to be used for drafting and coordinating, modeling, managing the detail portion of our document set. The worksheets really are like the scratch paper portion where we're using them for notes, legends, import and export functions. So we're not using them to necessarily store or study casework details, for example. Those really should be in the detail viewpoints. This is less of a comment on file performance and just more general organization. And then the last thing I want to cover, and I'm really hesitant to pull this up, this particular file, the drawing manager, has taken quite a while to load. It pops right up this time. But this is one area that we can really start to increase file performance and decrease file size. So there's nothing we can do about having to document these buildings, right? We need to have the interior elevations, the details, the elevation sections. Like, these are part of our drawing sets. But anytime I see something from a particular user's desktop, that has to be assumed to have been placed there temporarily, which is fine. Like dropping a DWG or a PDF from your desktop, from your downloads folder into a file, that's part of the workflow. But we should clear that stuff out of there as soon as possible, because ArchiCAD is processing and taking up processing speed, trying to find the link between a user's desktop and the file, which is, physically not possible for it to conclude that connection. So purging that stuff out of there is the right solution. Things like this, this is a perfect example of storing consultants' content in our document set. We do need to be able to reference our consultants' drawings. And again, that's something that we store in the file server and reference as a temporary DWG or PDF, unless it's becoming part of our documents or sort of part of an extended reference for presentation purposes or something like that. There's no need to fully embed this stuff in here long term. Certainly embed it so that other people can see it if necessary. But once we're done with the furniture coordination, once we got what we needed out of that, we should, for all extents and purposes, be able to delete that out of there. Especially with things like interiors, structural drawings, things like that. We're referencing that stuff, we're coordinating that stuff, recreating where necessary. More and more with IFC, there's less of that becomes necessary. But really looking for anything that's missing, anything with broken links, anything from an unshared location. And you can see that it is possible to create links from shared locations that will maintain that connection. So it's just making sure that you're dropping those from a shared path and not from your desktop or one of your shortcuts in the Finder. So looking for anything that's missing. In the drawing manager, you can actually sort by status. If you click on that column, you can see that it'll group by OK. Don't worry about if it says not read yet. That's not relevant. That just it recognizes that there is a link. It just hasn't been updated. But here, for example, I can see all of the missing content in this file. And most of this is not even from an external source. Most of this is from an internal view. So that's for example, a worksheet or a detail or a section or an elevation that's been created and then placed to a layout and then deleted out of the project map or view map. So all of these internal items, for example, these laundry items are on a sheet somewhere. So if we delete those out of there, that actually deletes the drawing from that sheet. There's no sense in keeping an internal view that's been deleted or that's missing, because you're literally recreating it from scratch anyway. So these are things that obviously were cleared out for whatever reason from the view map. And it could be something in the project map. Maybe it was part of like a process study or schematic study folder in the layout book, like the presentation plans, for example. Oftentimes will go missing if they get deleted from the view map. And if that's the case, they should be deleted out of the project map, or sorry, not the project map, the layout book as well. So keeping all of the missing content cleaned up, either linked properly or purged out of here, is going to result in a cleaner, faster file. Eliminating embedded content, eliminating missing content speeds the file up and reduces file size tremendously. And you can see just like the time it takes to process deleting these contents is adding to or contributing to the file slowness. You know, that's the sort of thing that open a layout with that missing drawing, it's going through that same process that it went through just to delete that. So, you know, keeping the drawing manager clean and linked properly is really critical to a clean and efficient file performance. I think that that's it in terms of comments on file performance audits. There are resources on the DubHub, or sorry, on the BIM manual for file audits, particularly regarding the efficiency audits. This checklist here is a good one to go through, making sure that the file is really cut down and as slim as possible in terms of polygon count, library management, attributes, the view map and project map content. You know, making sure that you're not like storing old stuff, labeling stuff old, do not use, unused, whatever. All of that stuff is really unnecessary if we're going to keep the files running efficiently. Keeping the drawing manager clean and trimmed down is also really critical. And like I said, I have done audits on files with this pollution. Let me see if I can snag that really quickly from my Google Drive. And I've cleaned up quite a few of these. So I've created this project health survey, and this all started as a way to evaluate which files had surface and attribute pollution. All of these red marked files all suffer from some amount of pollution. The green column here, these are the ones that I've actually gone through and cleaned up. So Manzanita, for example, has been cleaned up. The WP files are cleaned up. The ones where the problem is within the module, that's a bigger issue that I'll probably be meeting with these teams. So Feather Pebble has to deal with this, and the KR team currently are the only two project teams where this pollution has made it into a module. So it'd be great if everybody could just keep their eye out on it. You know, everybody or every project should technically have a job captain and a model manager. Sometimes that's the same thing. It could just be as simple as once a week opening up the surfaces. You know, not every week are we even looking at surfaces and checking to see if these polluted surfaces are popping up in your file. If they are, go through those steps to clean that up. You know, that's not more than a 3-minute process, as long as it hasn't made it into a module. Same thing with the drawing manager, just pulling up the drawing manager once a week and checking for missing linked and missing internal drawings. And always feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions about getting that stuff cleaned up. All right, that's all I've got for the presentation today. Is there any questions about any of that?
Hey, Patrick, just a quick question. So when you're creating a new surface for to be mapped in a project, does it matter what the size of that image is while bringing it in?
Absolutely, yeah. So if you're creating, that's a good point. Thanks, Anthony. If you're creating anything, bringing anything into ArchiCAD, you should be aware of the size of that file, especially if it's ending up in the embedded library. You know, if we sort here by file size, for example, you can see that actually the file size within this project isn't too bad, but there are, well, I guess these are all objects. Here's a surface, for example, a PNG that's 6.5 megs. You know, there's no hard threshold, but I've sort of put the recommended threshold in our file audits at 2 megs is sort of ideal. The idea being that if we have an 8 million polygon object or a model, or sorry, a 3 million polygon model, and there's an 8 megabyte image that's covering half of those polygons take a lot more processing power to understand how that surface maps out. So obviously, the lower file size for those surface images, the better. At some point, we're going to start to lose resolution and image quality. And that's sort of where I kind of came on the 2 to 2.5 meg threshold, is that at 2.5 megs, we can get a reasonably high resolution image. You know, we should never need a 300 DPI image that's going to cover the entire site. You know, that's especially now that we're using Twinmotion. But you know, lower resolution is going to drop file size. You know, smaller image size is going to drop file size. But you need to find that happy medium and that balance. And that's why I say there's no hard threshold. If, for example, this wood flooring is only on the slabs, it's not eating up a ton of polygons, this is probably acceptable. But if at all possible, we should be trying to keep those down. The same goes with objects. You know, if we have an object that's, you know, 500 megs, for example, and it's in the embedded library, it's going to bog things way, way down. You know, I always look at objects as like, how many polygons is it contributing? How many instances is it going to contribute? But anything in the embedded library, this 19 meg object, for example, is contributing 19 megs to the file size before it's even been placed. And then every time it's placed, it starts to eat into the file size and contribute to polygons beyond that. So be aware of file size, especially with like SketchUp objects. It's really easy to find something on SketchUp Warehouse and jump on it right away because it's exactly what you need. It looks great, but if you ignore the fact that it might be 100,000 polygons and it might be like half a gig, it's going to kill your file. So yeah, that's a really good point, is be aware of what you're bringing into the embedded library, not just in terms of pollution, but in terms of file size and complexity.
Hey, Pat,
Yeah.
when you talk about pollution, like copying files from different, or copying objects from different files, can you get that same kind of surface pollution when you're copying over, let's say, like detail line work from another file? Or like, let's say commonly, like if you're, I don't know, downloading like a new roofing profile, roof flashing profile from a manufacturer, and they give you like some weird DWG. Can you tell us a little bit about like the best process to get that safely and cleanly in your file?
Yeah, if it's a DWG from a manufacturer, I've never seen that bring in pollution. That said, 2D stuff has polluted ArchiCAD files from one ArchiCAD file to the next. I think one of the reasons that I don't see that in DWGs is if, for example, I saved out a DWG from this ArchiCAD file, which is polluted, and then opened that and copied and pasted that, the DWG doesn't contain those libraries. It converts those library parts into either drafting primitives, model primitives, or blocks that don't include that master GDL script. Copy and pasting from one ArchiCAD file to the next is going to bring in pollution if the file being copied from is polluted. The DWGs I'm less concerned about, but if you ever have any apprehensions, you can always sandbox that. You can always go to File, New, Latest Project Settings, and launch in a new instance. And then open that or copy and paste it in that instance of ArchiCAD and just check to see what pops up. I've never seen DWGs or PDFs or even SketchUp files placed into an ArchiCAD file pollute anything. The SketchUp file will pollute the surfaces if you convert it to morphs, because those embedded surface images that are hard-coded to that SketchUp GDL script then have to generate those surfaces. So that's where you see surfaces, and I'll see if there's any in here. They pop up in almost every file. It'll say, like in brackets, it'll say converted from object. And I don't see anything popping up in here to that effect. And unfortunately, I don't have a SketchUp object ready to roll in to demonstrate that. But that happens only when you bring in a SketchUp object and then convert it to morphs. And you could certainly use the delete and replace to just sort of broad sweep and replace all those converted surfaces out of the file.
Gotcha. I mean, is there like, I think I've seen a few times where you can get a bunch of random different line types or layers from like a sketchy manufacturer object. That's, I guess, a lesser kind of pollution than the
Yeah,
surfaces.
yeah, certainly if you just open a DWG right away, it's going to bring in their layers, their line types, whatever, their pen numbers. But that's less of a concern because that's not going to necessarily copy from one file to the next unless you're copying that stuff over. One of the best ways that I found, well, I used to always just drag and drop the DWG into the file, but we've been finding more and more instances of, for whatever reason, those drawings. So a DWG places as a drawing will have a different X to Y scale. So it distorts it warps the drawing somewhat. So my go-to method for bringing in DWGs now is to just open it in a new instance of ArchiCAD. You know, if you go File, Open, track down the DWG, and then open in a new instance of ArchiCAD, then you can grab all the content on that DWG and move it to the ArchiCAD layer. And that's going to ensure that nothing in that file, no layers at least in that file, come over. You can always use the attribute manager to audit the attributes and look for any red flags. They usually stand out from our template, you know, and a lot of times you end up with like solid line 1, solid line 2, solid line 3, you know, looking at the line types, for example. You know, these are the sorts of things like where these export layers don't necessarily make sense. We can usually clear those out. Anytime you see this like bracket 2, that means that there's a dot and dash 1 usually. So if you sort by name, for example, there's one here. These are the sorts of things that you can always grab those if you've reserved all, and you can say delete and replace with this other one. Something to consider. On bigger files like the KR file, that's harder to do because we're trying to manage attributes between multiple files. But on the average Walker-Warner file, that sort of cleanup should be done routinely, especially when you're bringing in content. Like I said, the layers, lines, and fill pollution is always less of a concern in my mind. Not that we should ignore it or disregard it. You know, anytime you see that pollution, the solution is reserve all and then delete and replace those attributes. But the surface pollution is one that's plagued our office and has really affected more than half of our projects.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying.
All right, guys.
Patrick, I have
Yeah.
a couple of comments as well from speaking on behalf of Barta and myself, overseeing technology generally. You mentioned earlier about just, you know, saving out PLNs or saving out files to preserve things. And again, you have that same kind of awareness and recognition that every time you do that, that's more data on the server, that over time, we don't want to have all of that data in perpetuity as well, because we back up data and we need to store all of that data as well. So, you know, we don't want to have gigs and gigs of extraneous data that's being stored unnecessarily as well. So the first option should always be purging things that are no longer needed nor need to be referenced ever again, which obviously will require judgment on the part of the project team. And then obviously, you know, feel free to archive and, you know, if needed at some key milestone dates to go back through and purge, you know, design studies or things that never will see the light of day from the file, so we don't have to keep storing them forever or backing them up.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Like, we don't need to save every iterative option. You know, like if we're talking about like, is the toilet rotated this way versus this way, we don't need a separate PLN for that. You know, it's a 10-second thing to switch it back. And same thing with like details. Like I said, with the examples of the do not use and the X'd out details, those are the sorts of things that if you have apprehensions about deleting that stuff, the archive doesn't need to be a long-term archive. You can save a PLA or a PLN to your desktop short term in order to purge that stuff out, verify that nothing went missing, and then move on. That can be wiped off your computer and not necessarily stored on the file server. It's really just a fail safe to ensure that what you're deleting isn't going to go missing.
I have a tip or trick for that. So when you save out PLNs, you're right, it saves out the entire project, like everything from your surfaces to your drawings and everything. So that, creates a giant file size. But if you go into 3D and then you save out whatever 3D model you have as a module, you can open up that mod file in a separate ArchiCAD instance, and it saves out only the 3D elements and nothing, and like none of the other like attributes that really kind of grows a file size. So like you could do a design study in a separate file, and like that file size is a fraction of the size of a PLN, which it's only a couple megabytes.
Yeah, and that solution, Chris, that actually works even with like iterative details, like we're looking at here with the 2D stuff. If there's any thought that like, oh, well, maybe this iteration might be needed, you can save 2D stuff out as a module as well. And then you're not putting like a 3 GB PLN on your desktop. A PLA is also a lot more compact than a PLN as well, because it excludes anything that hasn't been actively used in that file. So if you're worried about like needing to recover more than just the 3D or more than just this 2D instance, maybe it's something else all the way around, just doing a big sweeping cleanup on a file. Save a PLA, an archive file, to your desktop temporarily, do the cleanup, verify the documents still look good. And even if that PLA sticks around for a day or two just to ensure that nothing really went missing, there's no harm done there.
Couple other things. One is we, based on best practices a number of years ago, we actually added a note at the end of every Asana phase checklist to do a model review with Patrick at the end of every phase. So again, there should be a general time spent by the model manager at the end of schematic, at the end of DD, at the end of CDs to go through, purge, clean up, organize, the BIM file and the broader. It's just kind of like spring cleaning, that key milestone date. And there's literally, again, a check the box thing to do that kind of check and check in with Patrick and obviously maybe save out a file at that point at a minimum. So we have things that are kind of built into our processes to help teams organize and have best practices in that regard. And then there's a side note, Patrick, you mentioned having these best practices, excuse me, on your BIM blog, but are they also on the BIM manual? So they're easier to access and part of the first place that people would look, especially new hires or, longer tenured employees that haven't done it in a while. Rather than looking on the BIM blog, if it's some key information like that, I think the BIM manual is the appropriate place to have that.
Yes, there is an audit resource in here. Sorry, this always opens up to the.
You don't have to go to it now. I'm just saying as a general, my outsider observation is if you have like best practices stuff, obviously I know you communicate to the broader ArchiCAD community, which I think is valuable, worldwide, but core best practices should be in the BIM manual. And if you want to duplicate those to the broader community, then obviously I would encourage that too.
Yeah, the BIM blog was really just sort of a bump and a reminder that the audit checklist, the things that we should be looking out for, there's this sort of 50-point list of things to review within the project. And this includes things like the drawing manager that we need to evaluate and assess as just a general model management. Duplicate the library manager, embedded library, duplicated objects, missing objects, things like that always need to be sort of maintained and evaluated. Attributes need to be maintained and evaluated. So this is on the BIM manual, is like, this is our project audit, really. This is the full list. Yeah, the file performance, the 4 items on that BIM, the BIM blog post were really just sort of a bump or subparts of this bigger picture.
Well, I think you have to be explicit as you are in the BIM blog posting. I would also put that right in the BIM manual too.
Okay, understood.
Thank you.
All right, guys.
I had one more shout out. I've been noticing people have been going into our file and then not leaving the project, which, like, it's fine if you're in the file, but just I'm pretty sure that's still what we're supposed to do if you're not like on that project, to leave the teamwork file.
Yes, that is a good point. Like, the more users that are in a file, it does contribute to. I just want to pull up a couple examples here. The more users that are in a file, it does bloat that file size a bit. And it's not that we can't get into projects and look at or copy details out, but for example, the 4.7 gigs might drop to like 4.5 if there was only 2 or 3 users in here instead of the 6, because it is trying to fragment that out into usable partitions for all of these users. It does start to bloat that up a little bit. And you can see that this file, despite our best efforts, is sort of right at that threshold of what we know functions within ArchiCAD effectively, which is 3 to 5 gigs on the BIM server. It seems like a lot of information, but this file saved out as a PLN is less than 1 gigabyte. So the BIM server does bloat things. The more users connected on the BIM server, the more it's going to bloat that.
Michael Hackett explain himself.
I'll take responsibility for that one.
And
we cribbed some details for Barbie C from Carrot Creek, so good
Hey,
stuff.
I'm actively in this one working on using it as a reference, so I'm not in it lingering.
I was calling out the newer guy, Meg.
All right, okay.
No, and
right.
I do honestly, I do sweep the BIM servers at least once a week just to look for but the big red flags are, oh, there was somebody in that file like whatever 4 months ago and they haven't accessed it since, and that's all stamped on here. So people do routinely get booted out on the BIM server end if they had sort of this latent connection for more than 30 days. In this case, everybody's either currently in the file or they have been in the file within the last week. All right, everybody. I guess if I don't talk to you, have a good weekend. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. If you do see the file pollution, the library and surface pollution, and you have questions about it, I will be reaching out to teams whose files I haven't cleaned up yet. But as you saw from that Google Doc, I've actually cleaned up probably about 1/3 of the files that were currently polluted. And hopefully we'll get through all of them within the next couple of weeks.
Thanks, Pat.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Patrick.
thanks, Pat.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah.
Thanks.
Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick.